Let's hop into it. I titled the deck Ultimate Elementals because it is an elemental tribal-ish deck that is playing Genesis Ultimatum. Really like Genesis Ultimatum. Super expensive, but has a huge payoff. I think it's the most powerful of the Ultimatums. But yeah, let's jump into the deck tech. First up, it is a companion deck. So we are playing Euron Sky Nomad. Euron is a 5-mana 4/5 flyer that reads Companion. Your starting deck contains at least 20 cards more than the minimum deck size, meaning you have to have an 80 or more card deck. It also reads, when Euron enters the battlefield, exile any number of other non-land permanents you own and control. Return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So, important thing to realize, it says own and control. So if you take any of your opponent's creatures, you can't flicker them. Though I don't know why you would want to, because even if you could, I believe they would go back under their control anyways. But, important distinction to have. Let's hop into the cards. First up, we are mainboarding 2 Aether Gusts. This is so we don't mill ourselves out. For those of you who don't know, there's a cool interaction with Aether Gust and Tamiyo Collector of Tales. Once you get to know cards in your library, what you can do is you can Aether Gust your Tamiyo to the top of your library, and then once you draw Tamiyo, you can play her and minus her to get back Aether Gust and repeat that loop. And because of that, theoretically, we cannot lose due to decking ourselves. Next up, we have a 4 Leafkin Druid. It is a 2-mana mana dork, but if we have 4 creatures, it taps for 2 green instead of 1. And it is an elemental, so it fits our synergy. I like this card. It's a good little ramp creature. And in the late game, tapping for double green is important. Next up, we have Playset a Growth Spiral. A blue-green instant reads, draw a card. You may play a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Very distinct that this does not take up your land for turn. So you can play this, put a land card into play, and still have your land for turn. It is also an instant, so we can do this on our opponent's end step to get some sneaky ramp going. After that, we have Risen Reef. Risen Reef is our main payoff for being elemental synergy. Elemental tribal as well. It is a 3-mana 1/1 elemental that reads, whenever Risen Reef or another elemental enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you put that card onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't put that card onto the battlefield, put it into your hand. So, one thing to point out, it is a may to put the land onto the battlefield, so you can choose just to draw the land if there is any reason you'd want to do that, or you can just draw the card. So, very good card, very great elemental to play around. Next up, we have Uro. Just like every other blue-green deck, Uro is being played here. It is amazing. He lets us play an extra land, he gains us life, and overall, Uro is proving to be one of the best blue-green cards to come out of Theros. Maybe the best blue-green card in Standard, but we'll see. Next, we're playing 2 copies of Thassa Deep Dwelling. Thassa is a 4-mana 6/5. Legendary enchantment creature. She's indestructible and has the ability that if our devotion to blue is less than 5, she isn't a creature. Then, at the beginning of our end step, we can exile 1 other creature card we control, then return that card to the battlefield under our control, and for 4 mana, we can tap another target creature. Thassa is super important for some of the later cards we'll get into. It's cool just to flicker a Risen Reef if we want to. For more value, usually it just ends up drawing a card. One card we almost never want to flicker unless we need emergency life is Uro. One thing to keep in mind, if you are planning on flickering Uro, he will end up getting sacrificed because he will enter the battlefield without being escaped. So remember that if you do decide to build this deck yourself. But yeah, Thassa is a good little flicker target. We talked about Tamiyo earlier. She is a 4-mana planeswalker with a static ability that says, spells and abilities our opponent control can't cause us to discard cards or sacrifice permanents. So, this makes Thought Erasure do nothing. It makes it to where Priest of Forgotten Gods does not make us sacrifice a creature. So, very relevant static ability in the current metagame. Her +1 is choose a non-land card name, then reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put all the cards with the chosen name among them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So, helps us dig for usually Nissa or some other tech cards we're looking for, More importantly, this is a really good way to feed our Uro to make sure that Uro is going to be easily escaped later on. Putting the 4 cards into her graveyard really helps. And her minus also synergizes with her +1. It lets us return target card from our graveyard to our hand. So if we do mill a creature that we didn't want to mill, or any card rather that we didn't want to mill, we can get it back with Tamiyo. Very solid Planeswalker. Also, like we said earlier, is in here with Aether Gust to make sure we don't mill out. Next up, we have Omnath, Locus of the Royal. This is the 3-color Omnath from M20. He is a legendary elemental that reads, when he enters the battlefield, he does damage to any target equal to the number of elementals we control. And whenever a land enters the battlefield, we can put a 1/1 counter on target elemental, and if 8 or more lands are in play, we draw a card. Just to clarify, a land enters the battlefield under our control. But yeah, Omnath is one of the better elementals. He's a removal spell in the early game. He can be lethal in the late game. And we tend to ramp out a lot. So once we have 8 lands, every land drop drawing us a card is very important. Another cool synergy we have is with our Thassa. We can flicker our Omnaths for lethal a lot of the time. We will easily get an abundance of elementals into play. So it is very realistic that we win the game through flickering Omnath. After Omnath, we have Cavalier of Thorns. He is another elemental. He is a 5-mana 5/6 with reach, and he reads, when Cavalier of Thorns enters the battlefield, reveal the top 5 cards of your library, put a land card from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest into your graveyard. So a couple things to point out there. One, the land enters untapped, so we can sometimes use him to play a 5-drop into a 1-drop, or even a 2-drop if it's later in the turn. And all those cards go to the graveyard. So again, we're feeding Uro to make sure we can escape him as soon as possible and as many times as possible. He has another ability that when he dies, we can choose to exile him. And if we do, we get to put another target card from our graveyard on top. So his die trick is very important. Sometimes we can loop Cavaliers in, not into each other because he does exile, but we could get another Cavalier back or any of our previous named cards. So it's really good at keeping us consistent. And overall, just one of the better elementals of the deck. Next up, we have Nissa. Nissa is another Planeswalker with a static ability. Hers is that our forests add an additional green. Because of that, we're playing a good amount of forests. The new Temur Triland is a forest, as well as Stomping Ground and Breeding Pool from the Ravnica sets. Her +1 is put 3 1/1 counters on target non-creature land you control. The wording there is important because you can't put the same counters on the same land over and over again. It also untaps the land, and it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with vigilance and haste. It is still a land. So we can use that to do a couple things. One is tap a forest for 2 green, plus her to untap it, and then tap it again for another 2 green. Or we can just use her to push lethal, because she's making 3/3s with vigilance, which tends to be very aggressive. She does have an ultimate. This doesn't happen often, but when you do pull it off, it is very powerful. What it does is you get an emblem that says your lands are indestructible, and you search your library for any number of forests and put them directly into play tapped. So, if we ever get to ult her and all our 3/3s that she's made have stuck around, those are now indestructible 3/3 creatures with vigilance. So, we will usually end up getting lethal off of that, just being able to send our 3/3 army in with no regrets of them being chump blocked and killed. And they have vigilance, so they are also doing double duty on defense. It is also important to point out that the 3/3 she makes are elementals, so if we are on the Flicker Omnath train, she will help feed that. Overall, Nissa, probably the most powerful green Planeswalker in Standard right now, and the most powerful Planeswalker in our deck. We're playing a backup copy of Euron in the main board. We covered what he did earlier, but we have one that will be our companion and one in our main board, so we can double up on its ability. Next up, we're playing 2 Agent of Treachery. Agent of Treachery is a 7-mana 2/3, but for an Enter the Battlefield ability, it lets us gain control of target permanent. So that is any permanent. It can be a land, a Planeswalker, an opponent's Elspeth Conquers Death before it's about to pop off on the final mode. And then it also reads, at the beginning of your end step, if you control 3 or more permanents you don't own, draw 3 cards. So, super good at regassing our hand. A couple other synergies here. We can flicker him with Thassa to take permanent at the end of every turn. Usually if we get that going, it's enough for our opponent to concede, because that is backbreaking. If it goes on too long, we can steal all their lands, and there's not too much they can do about it. It is also a really good target to hit on our next card, Genesis Ultimatum. Genesis Ultimatum was on my top 5 cards of the set. I believe I had it at number 3. After playing with this card for a little bit, I am convinced that this is the best Ultimatum of the set. If not this one, possibly the Sultai one, but we're here to talk about Genesis Ultimatum. It reads, look at the top 5 cards of your library, put any number of permanent cards from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest into your hand. Exile Genesis Ultimatum. So, if we don't reveal any permanents to go onto the battlefield, at least we get to draw them, and our deck is all about enter the battlefield abilities, so anything we find is gonna do double duty with a enter the battlefield trigger, and honestly, we're looking to find any of these cards. Even Uro. Uro will get sacrificed, but hey, we'll gain 3 life, we'll draw a card, we'll maybe get to play an additional land, and it'll be late enough to where we might even just be able to escape him all in the same turn. This card is just the whole build around. It's the namesake of the deck in Ultimate Elemental, and I really like it. Finding an agent's powerful as well, being able to steal something. But yeah, Genesis Ultimatum, one of the better cards to come out of Ikoria, and I think it just might be the best Ultimatum. We have a couple more cards. We have Enduray's Forerunners. This is in here for a small combo we're playing. So it is an 8 mana 7/7 with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. And when it enters the battlefield, it gives other creatures we control +2/+2, Vigilance, and Trample until end of turn. So the reason why we're playing this card is because of this next card, Finale of Devastation. Finale of Devastation is X green for a sorcery. We get to search our library and graveyard for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less and put it onto the battlefield. Then shuffle your library. If X is 10 or more, creatures you control get +X/+X and gain haste until end of turn. So a lot of the times what we try to do is play this for X equals 10. Nissa really helps in doing that with our force tapping for double, so it happens way more often than without her. And we try and tutor up the Forerunners. We give our board +12/+12, 10 of it coming from the Finale, 2 of it coming from the Forerunners. And that's usually lethal. +12/+12 Trample, Vigilance, Haste is a lot of beef, a lot of abilities, and most people can't deal with it, and it ends up being lethal. So that is the small combo we're running. We have one more card before we get to the lands. That's Hydroid Krasis. Hydroid Krasis been seeing a lot of play ever since it's been printed. It is a X blue-green for a creature. The creature has flying and trample and enters the battlefield with X counters on it. We also get to gain half X life and draw half X cards, rounded down. Essentially what that means is if we play this X equals 8, we'll draw 4 cards, we'll gain 4 life, and we will have an 8/8 flying trample. Very good card. Again, great synergy with Nissa. And probably again, it might be tied with Uro for being the best blue-green card in Standard. Uro might edge it out, but this card, a lot of power. Our lands are pretty simple. We're playing a couple basics and a playset of Fabled Passages to make sure our fixing is good. And then we have a playset of every dual land in our color, and we have a 3 of the tri-land. We have an 80-card deck. We're playing a little bit more than average lands, but yeah, just essential fixing, and I have not had any land issues with this mana base. The playset of Fabled Passage really is a big proponent of that. Alright, we're going to move on to the sideboard. We do have to play Euron in our sideboard. That is how the companion ability works. He exists inside of our sideboard. Outside of that, we're playing 2 red cap melees. I've gone over red cap melee a lot, but we'll read it again just for those of you who are unfamiliar. It reads, red cap melee does 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If a non-red permanent is dealt damage this way, you sacrifice a land. But you're usually hitting a red permanent anyways. We bring this in against mono-red and Gruul. Just very good at getting rid of Tybalts, getting rid of Robber of the Rich. It kills Torbrin. It kills Bonecrusher Giants. There's a lot of beefy creatures we want to get rid of with this. We are playing 2 Healer of the Glade. This is also for aggressive matchups. It is a 1 mana 1/2 elemental, so it fits our elemental synergy. And when it enters the battlefield, we gain 3 life. So usually help us get to the late game against mono red and other aggressive decks to make sure that they just don't run us over. And if we can get to the late game, we can usually win. We have a third copy of Aether Gust on the board. We board this in against almost any deck playing Uro, playing Nissa, just really tricky green for the most part cards. We'll also bring it in against mono red to hit their Embercleave. This is very big. If you can bounce their Embercleave before damage, they usually make very bad attacks to ensure that Embercleave can be played. So this is a big blowout against Embercleave and other red-green cards. We are playing 1 Negate. I was playing 3 Mystical Disputes, but that card can fall off in the late game and do nothing. So we bring in a copy of Negate to make sure that we can hit essentially anything in the late game. If we were a white deck, this would be a Dovin's Veto, but sadly don't have access to white, so we're playing Negate. Then we have 2 copies of Fry. Fry is for Teferi mostly. We also bring it in against other Teamer decks to try and hit Tamiyo. Fry is a 2-mana instant that can't be countered. It does 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker that's white or blue. We're playing 2 copies of Wilt. We talked about Wilt a little bit earlier, but yeah, Wilt is a 2-mana instant that destroys an artifact or an enchantment, and it cycles. Really like playing this. It cycles when we don't need it, and when we do need it, it will usually be for Fires of Invention or Wilderness Reclamation. Other enchantments that see play very slightly. We might board this in against Bant for their Elspeth Conquers Death. And not too many artifacts we're worried about in this deck. But yeah, Wilt very, very good at dealing with mostly enchantments, and the cycle gives it a big upside. We're playing 2 Mystical Disputes. We'll bring this in against most blue decks. It's very powerful. It is a 3-mana instant that says counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. And if that spell is blue, this only costs 1 blue mana to cast. So very powerful counterspell. Then our last 2 cards of the sideboard are Flame Sweep. Flame Sweep is a 3-mana instant. It does 2 damage to each creature except creatures we control with flying. We really only play Euron as our flyer, but most Earth creatures don't die to this. Our 3/3 elementals from Nissa don't. We're mostly just losing our... in the main board are Risen Reefs to this, because even our Leafkin Druid will survive. We bring this in against Mono Red and against the Aristocrats deck. Right now it's Rakdos Sacrifice, but soon I expect that to be Mardu Aristocrats as an instant speed board wipe to try and get rid of their board before they can get too many sack shenanigans going on, or in Mono Red's case, before they can overrun us. But yeah, that is our Ultimate Elementals deck. I hope you guys enjoy it.